Okay.
So here we go. Well, hello, folks. This is our last student ambassador meeting of the year. It's May, and we have wonderful guests here, Nikki Johnson from the University of West Georgia, who's going to talk to us about consciousness and sort of the latest ideas going on through there. She just came back from a very important conference, and we look forward to hearing some of her experiences and her thoughts. Just a reminder, one of the great things that we can do at Student Ambassadors is give you an opportunity to present like Nikki's doing here, and it's something to put on your CV as a professional presentation. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Johnson.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Richard, for giving me the opportunity to share it with everyone for posterity. And so let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. I think we should be live. So let's see, I'll go to my slides here. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So the title of this talk is Rethinking the Nature of Consciousness, addressing the hard problem, binding problem, and anomalous experiences with zero-point field theory and the Astroglia Syncytium. And I know what you're thinking. What does all of that mean? Don't worry, we'll get into it. So this is essentially a compacted version of the best of the things that I presented at various conferences for this year. So the title comes from the talk that I gave at the Science of Consciousness conference, where I addressed three long-standing problems in consciousness studies, namely the hard problem, binding problem, and anomalous experiences, that all seem to relate to the same mechanism in the brain, specifically astrocytes. Next, we'll move into some of the highlights from the talk that I gave at the APA Division 32 conference, which you attended, and I really appreciated that, including specific applications of this framework for humanistic and transpersonal psychology, with particular focus on the work of Roberto Assagioli and his depiction of the unconscious. I feel like it's really helpful in contextualizing a lot of modern study findings in ways that he doesn't get enough credit for. Next, we'll move into some of the highlights from the talk that I gave at the University of West Georgia's SPARC conference, where I focused on the intersection between transliminality, neurodivergence, and criticality. And again, we'll get into what those terms mean. Finally, we'll look at some relevant slides from a class presentation that I taught for Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore's Psychedelics and Psychology course at the University of West Georgia. So buckle up. Now, before I get into the content itself, let me just give you a bit of brief background on who I am and where this information comes from. So of course, my name is Nikki Johnson, and I am a psychology PhD student at the University of West Georgia. And the name of the program at the University of West Georgia for psychology is Consciousness and Society. And that was certainly one of the initial things that attracted me to this particular school. The other thing is that they are one of two public universities that specifically focuses on humanistic and transpersonal psychology. So the development of human potential, things like self-actualization, self-transcendence, but also altered states, mystical experiences, and anomalous experiences. So two current areas of focus for me as part of my PhD program are, and they are very, very closely interlinked as well, an interdisciplinary model of consciousness, as well as the neural correlates of altered states and peak and plateau experiences. And the second one is mostly what this talk that I will be giving here is about. But essentially, In 2007, I started to have near daily encounters with what Carl Jung called synchronicities. So these weird coincidences between events that didn't feel as though they should be related in any particular way. And so this sent me into a search into all different types of nonfiction. So psychology, science, comparative religious studies, spirituality, philosophy, looking for answers. And 17 years later, some of the answers that I've come to in terms of the mechanisms that could underlie these experiences for myself also feel as though they relate to some long-standing issues in the field of consciousness studies at large. And so really exciting stuff. And to punctuate that, so my presentation at the Science of Consciousness conference was actually attended by the head of the conference, Stuart Hameroff, and he referenced it 2 days later in one of his plenary speeches. So really cool things we're going to look at. So let's dive right into it. For centuries, we as a species have struggled to wrap our heads around the ontological nature and mechanistic means of consciousness, presuming, as mainstream Western science tends to assume, that consciousness is produced by the brain and therefore confined to it. 3 issues have emerged as particularly stubborn challenges from this perspective. 1, the hard problem, the explanatory gap that seems to exist in accounting for the basis of subjective experience in the context of physical matter. 2, the binding problem, the issue of how separate features somehow combine to form a unified perceptual experience. And 3, the problem of anomalous experiences, a peculiar array of subjectively reported conscious experiences and phenomena that seem to challenge normative beliefs about what is even possible based upon their apparent inability to be explained by the prevailing paradigm. Although anomalous experiences receive far less attention in mainstream discussion of consciousness, they may in fact be the key factor to resolving all of these problems by signaling the existence of ontological misassumptions that have tended to be applied in the search for answers about consciousness without awareness of these misconceptions. In effect, by suspending the presupposition that consciousness simply must begin and end with neuronal activity in the brain, and considering instead that consciousness may be a more fundamental aspect of the cosmos with both local and non-local properties, we do find, as Thomas Kuhn suggested in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that these anomalies may lead us toward a paradigm-shifting breakthrough. This presentation addresses all 3 of these problems simultaneously by building on the work of experts based in many different disciplines, with a type of glial cell known as astrocytes playing a highly underrated mechanistic role. Taken together, this presentation offers specific mechanisms based in physics and neurophysiology that may address 3 of the toughest challenges associated with consciousness all at once. So let's dive into the nitty-gritty, starting with the hard problem. Zero-point field theory has been proposed by Joachim Kepler, a PhD in theoretical physics. He postulates that conscious experiences are constructed through, wait for it, synchronization of individual microcolumns in the brain with ordered states or modes, so essentially patterns of vibration in the 0-point field. This is the field that underlies all electromagnetic phenomena. It is the ground state. It is the field of fields. You cool everything to absolute 0, you will still have intrinsic fluctuations. It is the vacuum state. It contains nothing but gives rise to everything. So conceivably, it is what the Buddhists were referring to in terms of sunyata, or the great void, what the Hindus may have been referring to as Purusha, and what the Gnostics referred to as pleroma. But anyway, getting back to Kepler's theory, it suggests that each time one of these microcolumns synchronizes with an ordered state in this field, it's like pulling in a different little shade of phenomenal awareness. And with approximately 200 million of these microcolumns in the brain, that leaves quite a lot of room for nuance and phenomenal richness. And so extremely simplified ramifications of this theory. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. Instead, the brain is more akin to a radio, tuning into particular frequency patterns from the source of all electromagnetic phenomena. And to generate our conscious experiences, we each essentially synchronize with just a tiny little subset of all of the vibrations within this all-pervasive field of timeless, spaceless potential. Now, how do astrocytes play in the mix? Well, it just so happens that all of the conditions necessary for the formation of quantum coherence in a given microcolumn are regulated by the same mechanism, astrocytes. Namely, these conditions are average tissue concentration of glutamate within that microcolumn, which corresponds to the ground state, synaptic vesicle concentration of glutamate, which corresponds to the excited state, and finally, synchronization of neuronal firing within that microcolumn. Now, Kepler's 2023 paper recognizes that the first two conditions are regulated by astrocytes. I happen to notice in reading through that paper that the third condition also regulated by the same mechanism. Astrocytes coordinate this through calcium waves. This is essentially like a second language that astrocytes use to communicate with other astrocytes, with neurons, and with other brain cells. And it helps to coordinate, it would seem, whole brain functioning in ways that we'll get into in the next section. So let's move into that one, the binding problem. Fun fact, astrocytes are interconnected across the entire brain and spinal cord via channels between cells called gap junctions, forming a mycelium-like network known as a functional syncytium, enabling them to work together as a single unit or collective identity. It's a little known fact, or at least little publicized. I feel like these little guys need a better PR team. But this has prompted a contemporary revival of Camillo Golgi's reticular theory based on this network of astrocytes. So back in 1906, you had two guys who won a joint Nobel Prize together with seemingly opposing theories. You had Camillo Golgi and his reticular theory, which suggested that the central nervous system works as a single unit. And you had Santiago, Ramon, and Cajal with his neuronal doctrine, which suggested that the brain is made up of individual neurons. And when technology allowed for individual cells within the brain to be observed, Ramon and Cajal's theory overshadowed Golgi's theory. But we are learning now that Golgi's vision may in fact be recognized or realized through this network of astrocytes. This gets us into the work of Michael Levin, which is very cool. So when connected by open gap junctions, cells have access to the same information and can work together to achieve larger scale collective goals that go beyond the self-interest of individual cells. And so, for example, the cells in your heart are interconnected by these gap junctions, and this allows them to work together to contract the muscle that is your heart. And it's very good for us at the human scale. Similarly, the cells in the locus coeruleus in your brain, which is the hub of attention, also are interconnected by these gap junctions. And this allows them to work together to release norepinephrine across the cortical surface, triggering attention. So almost all of the cells in your body are interconnected by these gap junctions, and they can either be open or closed. But essentially, when they are open, this is akin to like a hive mind at the cellular level. I've included here a clip from Michael Levin on the Musing Mind podcast, talking specifically about gap junctions, and I highly recommend it. You can find it on YouTube. Meanwhile, on top of that, we also have this tripartite synapse or multipartite synapse concept, which emphasizes astrocytes' highly active role in synaptic activity. So the traditional view of the synapse is you've got a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, illustrated here in blue. This tripartite synapse or multipartite synapse concept stresses that astrocytes, shown here in green, play an equally important role. They exchange information with both the pre and postsynaptic neurons, and they respond to the neurotransmitters released there with two things. One of them is elevations of calcium. So again, these are these calcium waves that they use to communicate with other astrocytes, with neurons, and with other brain cells. The second thing is a release of other neuroactive substances, such as glutamate, ATP, and D-serine. And in turn, they control a whole bunch of different things like neuronal excitability, synaptic transmission, and long-term plasticity. So for a long time, glial cells, like astrocytes, were thought of as just mortar for the brain, basically providing structural support. And as time has gone along, scientists have realized, wow, these things have a ton of responsibilities. And if we consider that in the context of these two things, that they are interconnected across the entire brain and spinal cord, and they have their little fingers on the pulse of all of these different synapses, wow, it seems like this really helps to coordinate things on a holistic basis in the brain and spinal cord. So they have important roles such as regulating blood flow, sending energetic support to the most active areas of the brain, feeding neurons, releasing ATP for energy, regulating neuroplasticity, synchronizing neurons on multiple timescales, including circadian rhythms, and facilitating complex information processing, learning, and memory. Really important stuff. Other findings that are interesting and relevant with respect to astrocytes are that they are sensitive to anesthesia. And this is particularly helpful in the context of discussions of consciousness, because this is frequently used as a litmus test for theories of consciousness. Also, astrocytes are much larger and more complex in humans as compared to non-primate animals. And so they're thought to have played a crucial role in the evolution of the complexity of the cerebral cortex and potentially relative levels of consciousness in animals versus humans. They're also found to be more pronounced in Einstein's brain, with larger sized processes or extensions than the average person has, is one of very few differences that were observed upon autopsy of his brain. Also, these gap junctions act as what is known as low pass filters. So they block frequencies above a certain level. And intuitively, that feels for me as though it may be involved in Aldous Huxley's reducing valve. And we'll get back to that concept in a couple slides. But finally, astrocytes have been shown to be intimately involved in transition between brain states, including multiple phases of sleep and various states of wakefulness, such as inattentiveness, vigilance, quiet wakefulness associated with learning and memory. It's clear that they play an active role in transitions into altered states, which leads us into our next section, anomalous experiences. So to set up the content in this section, let's take a quick look at the critical brain hypothesis. So in brief, the brain appears to operate near a critical point between two distinct phases of activity, order and disorder. On the right-hand side of this chart, you see supercriticality. This is the disorderly phase. And so here, we have really fast responses, but they are wildly unpredictable. On the opposite end, subcriticality, or the orderly phase, you have really precise responses, reliable, but they don't tend to spread from one neuron to the next very easily. They tend to stall out. And in between these two opposite ends of the spectrum, you have what is known as the critical point. And this appears to facilitate optimal information processing, as well as a really high level of sensitivity to stimuli. So on one hand, it appears that the brain likes to live at this critical point because of the advantages that it is afforded. But at the same time, it is really intense there, and it gets blown back by this constant barrage of stimuli to what is known as a quasi-critical point, near the critical point, but not right on it. in normal waking state. However, in altered states of consciousness, such as those observed with meditation, psychedelic states, mystical and anomalous experiences, these appear to edge the brain activity closer to the critical point, and in so doing, seem to enable more complex, previously unconscious information to enter our subjective conscious awareness from the 0-point field. So for me, this feels like a mechanistic explanation for Aldous Huxley's reducing valve. There's a really great paper from Marco Macy from 2023 that sets this up beautifully. So he says, Aldous Huxley proposed that the brain is a reducing valve of mind at large, a universal or cosmic mind comprising all of reality. So this sounds a whole lot like the way Kepler describes the 0-point field as part of his theory, doesn't it? Now, Huxley himself says that to make survival possible biologically, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. Getting back to Macy, he says that according to Huxley, our mind filters reality because otherwise we would be overwhelmed by the knowledge of this universal mind. Gosh, this sounds like exactly what this critical brain hypothesis and associated findings have uncovered. That, from one perspective, the brain would like to live at that critical point, but at the same time, it is too intense there. It would be completely overwhelming. And so it gets pushed back to this quasi-critical point where we can actually handle the amount of stimuli that enters our conscious awareness. And so a final point made by Macy in terms of summarizing Huxley's ideas is that the brain filters and suppresses the universal mind, but it does not produce it. And that is one of the main points that this talk is getting through, that this is one of the ontological misassumptions that we need to address in order to reach the answers that we seek about the mechanisms and nature of consciousness. So, how do astrocytes play into the mix? Well, through uptake and release of glutamate and GABA, excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, respectively, they maintain what is known as excitation-inhibition balance. So when you hear about chemical imbalances in the brain, this would be one of those. It just so happens that excitation-inhibition balance is directly linked to brain criticality. It is known as the control parameter, the independent variable upon which the phase of brain activity depends, otherwise known as the order parameter. So expressed in very simple terms, if you have a greater overall amount of excitation, this equates to supercriticality. If you have greater overall amount of inhibition, this equates to subcriticality. Thus, in regulating excitation-inhibition balance and the phase of brain activity with respect to this critical point, if the brain is like a radio, then astrocytes could be considered, in layman's terms, the metaphorical tuner of the brain radio, dialing up and dialing down the amount of information that can stream into our subjective conscious awareness from the 0-point field. Wow. Huge implications. And with that, let's take a look at some of the applications for humanistic and transpersonal psychology. To connect the dots, let's take a brief look at the work of Roberto Asagioli, a humanistic and transpersonal psychologist and psychiatrist, particularly with respect to his depiction of the unconscious. And a link to the full presentation that I gave at the APA Division 32 conference can be found at tinyurl.com/unconsciousegg2. Roberto Asagioli was an Italian psychiatrist and psychotherapist who lived from 1888 to 1974. And he was an initial follower and a contemporary of Freud and Jung. And he actually opened the first psychoanalytic practice in Italy. However, by the time he wrote his dissertation in 1910, it ended up being a critique of psychoanalysis. He argued that it was overly focused on the pathological aspects of the psyche. He agreed with Freud about the importance of healing childhood trauma and developing a healthy ego. However, he asserted that there is much more to human growth than just these two aspects. And so he advocated for a more holistic approach. The name that he gave to this approach is psychosynthesis. So this is a clinically applied form of psychotherapy incorporating transpersonal aspects of human experiences. And he argued that this helped address the full spectrum of unconscious content through not only what is traditionally termed depth psychology, so peeling back various unconscious layers of the psyche with particular concentration on the lower aspects, but also height psychology. This is a Frankl and a Vygotsky term, which refers to focus on enabling the highest human potential. And so, as defined by Astroglia, psychosynthesis is a method of psychological development and self-realization for those who refuse to remain the slave of their own inner phantasms or of external influences, who refuse to submit passively to the play of psychological forces which is going on within them, and who are determined to become the master of their own lives. So Astroglia was a true psychological pioneer. He was one of the first psychologists to recognize the spiritual nature of human beings, along with Abraham Maslow. He was one of the original pioneers of both humanistic and transpersonal psychology. Humanistic psychology would correspond to what he termed personal psychosynthesis. This was an attempt to understand the healthy nature of personality integration and self-actualization, becoming all you can be within your own lifetime. Whereas transpersonal psychology, what he referred to as spiritual or transpersonal psychosynthesis, refers to a study of peak and mystical experiences, as well as a shift beyond individual selfhood toward a sense of unitive reality. So one of the most emblematic images associated with psychosynthesis, his school of thought, is this egg diagram of the psyche. And I particularly appreciate these three different levels that he broke out for the content of the unconscious, for the purpose of explaining the full spectrum of aspects that we can find in this unconscious realm. So Freud tended to focus on what he termed the lower unconscious. This would include things like the coordination of bodily functions, primitive drives and urges, as well as really intense emotional complexes and things that we would label parapsychological and pathological. But Astroglia stressed that there are additional aspects of the unconscious that deserve equal attention. And he broke them out into two additional layers. So the middle unconscious refers to routine processes that go on within the mind beneath the surface of conscious attention that help us get through our day-to-day activities, things like the assimilation of various experiences, elaboration and building on those mental processes, as well as future planning. Then we have the higher unconscious or superconscious, which includes things like higher intuitions, creative inspiration, genius level ideas, heroic, ethical imperatives. I want to do something really big for the world, as well as ecstasy and bliss. Now, just to give us the full context on this diagram. So number 4, as labeled here, the green circle, corresponds to the field of conscious awareness. So this is the ever-changing stream of thoughts, feelings, sensations, imaginings, intuitions, primitive drives that we have that kind of feel like they make up our sense of reality for ourselves. And this is separate in his diagram from what is labeled here as 5, so the conscious self, or I, this point of pure self-awareness, which is separate from that ever-changing stream of content. And then he also has 6 here, the transpersonal self, or the higher self. This is like a meta-awareness situated beyond or above that flow, that ever-changing flow of psychological contents, otherwise known as the individuated self. So all of these things that are colored here in this diagram as shown, this would refer to things that Jung called the personal unconscious. Everything outside of that, labeled as 7, would be the collective unconscious. So that was the way that Astroglia originally depicted his diagram. However, more contemporary psychosynthesis, so people who really appreciate Assagioli's model and use it on a regular basis, including people like John Furman, Ann Russell, Thomas Youmans, and many others, have all looked at that aspect, his diagram, and have basically recommended a very similar revision to that original depiction of it. So instead of depicting the transpersonal self or the higher self as being situated above the higher unconscious, they recommend that actually the transpersonal self pervades all of the elements of this diagram. So they take that off the board. It's like, in scientific terms, this would be the 0-point field for Kepler. This is what everything that is shown here arises from. So this is one way of depicting that concept by Furman and Russell and Youmans. However, other contemporary psychosynthesis depicted it in a slightly different way. So for example, Thomas Schutt, whose work is featured on the Psychosynthesis Trust website, he depicts this same sort of idea in a slightly different way. So we have the transpersonal self located along the edges of the personal unconscious. But the point is that, or sort of a saying that relates to this, is that despite these differences, the map is not the territory. In other words, this is like the visual equivalent of differences in semantics. What is ultimately more important are the conceptual implications of these revisions to the diagram. And that comes down to this. Growth and development of human potential is achieved through synthesis and integration of previously repressed content from both the lower and the higher unconscious. The humanistic and transpersonal psychologists say that this is an innate drive within all of us, and this process opens us up to increasing depths and heights of human experience. And so to contextualize this concept in terms of criticality and the other things that we've been talking about in the context of this full framework, it would appear that shifts of brain activity toward the critical point appear to allow information to enter our conscious awareness from any and all levels of the unconscious, so the higher, middle, and lower. Because this dynamic opens the doors of perception to otherwise unconscious aspects in an indiscriminate way. In other words, it's not possible to selectively tap into the goodies of the higher unconscious. There is one mechanism, shifting the brain activity closer to the critical point allows features from multiple levels of the unconscious to present simultaneously. So we open ourselves up in this way to both new depths and heights of human experience. And so before we wrap up this section on humanistic and transpersonal psychology, definitely wanted to address the concept of peak and plateau experiences within the context of this framework. So Abraham Maslow defined two distinct types of transpersonal or self-transcendent experiences, namely peak experiences and plateau experiences. So peak experiences are transient or fleeting altered states of consciousness, such as those experienced through psychedelics, during meditation, and spontaneous, mystical, and anomalous experiences. And I would suggest, as many other researchers already have, that this involves temporary shifts toward the critical point, allowing this material to enter our conscious awareness. We also have, though, plateau experiences as defined by Maslow, which would be more stable and sustained states of being with this sense of connectedness to unitive reality. And I would suggest that this involves a shift of normal wakefulness much closer to the critical point than it would ordinarily be. So it becomes more of a default state for that person. Which leads us beautifully into the next section, transliminality neurodivergence, and criticality. So this section was adapted from my talk at the Student Psychology Annual Research Conference at the University of West Georgia, entitled Neurodivergence, Transliminality, and Criticality. And for a link to the full slides, you can go to tinyurl.com/transliminalbrain. The main idea of this talk was that transliminality and criticality have each been closely linked to altered states of consciousness and various mental health conditions. And yet, these two topics have rarely, if ever, been addressed together in academic literature. So before we go any further, let's make sure we all know what these terms mean. So we've defined what criticality is. Transliminality is a term coined or adapted by Michael Tauborn, which refers to individual differences from person to person in the ease or threshold with which unconscious processes and external stimuli enter into conscious awareness. So I would suggest that this refers to the differences from one person to the next and how close that person's brain activity lives to the critical point. Neurodivergence refers to significant differences in brain functioning, often labeled in pathological terms, that deviate from dominant society-based standards of what is considered to be typical or normal. And of course, autistic spectrum disorders would be just one example of these types of things. So the bottom line is that this framework highlights the apparent role of astrocytes in crucial aspects of transliminality, neurodivergence, criticality, and anomalous experiences within a broader context that helps to explain the dynamics of consciousness in general, linking all of these subjects together within a single self-consistent neurophysics model. So this was really cool. This was a graphic that appeared in one of the keynote speeches at the APA Division 32 conference, which helps to illustrate this point so nicely. So the average mind, it is shown, tends to vacillate between desirable, interesting thoughts, everyday thoughts, and undesirable, interesting thoughts. Whereas the OCD mind, for example, tends to have a much wider range. It goes from desirable fringe thoughts through the range of the average mind all the way to undesirable fringe thoughts. So just a wider spectrum of experience, exactly what we've been talking about throughout this presentation. I feel like examples abound in modern academic literature where we see this combination of aspects from the lower, middle, and higher unconscious in ways that might otherwise be baffling. So to just name a few, we have Brower and Carhart-Harris 2021 talking about spiritual experiences and psychosis. We have Valente and colleagues in 2018 talking about creativity and psychiatric illness. We have, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name, Pediatakis in 2012 talking about genius and major mental disorders. We have Taylor in 2017 talking about mood disorders and creativity. Adler and Hirschfield in 2012 talking about mixed emotions and spiritual breakthroughs. We have Peterson and colleagues in 2011 talking about self-realization and depression. We have Fleck and colleagues in 2018 talking about paranormal beliefs, creative personal traits, and mystical and manic experiences. I feel like Assagioli's work in breaking out these different layers of the conscious really helps to contextualize what we see in a lot of these modern studies. And as just a final section to give us some vivid examples of how this works, we can look at some applications for psychedelic therapy. So this next section was adapted from an online class presentation that I taught at the University of West Georgia, Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore's Psychedelics and Psychology class. And this was entitled Psychedelic Mushrooms, Apparent Effects on Subjective Human Perception, a Thematic Analysis Study. It was based on a project that I had done the previous semester for Dr. Neil Korobov's Human Science Methodologies course. And in this project, I looked at 100 trip reports pulled from a site called bluelight.org, where recreational users of these substances reported on their experiences. And so a link to the full video presentation can be found at tinyurl.com/magicmushroomeffects. So the 7 themes that I identified in this study as being common within many of these different trip reports came down to these. 1, sensory amplification and distortion. 2, strange bodily sensations. 3, spatiotemporal anomalies. 4, emotional intensity and mood swings. 5, epiphanies and insights. 6, spirituality and religiosity motifs. 7, death and rebirth archetypes. The most prominent motif to emerge from the study was simultaneous presentation of new depths and heights of experience, rendering the reported experience all at once both intensely terrifying and exhilarating. So reported experiences for these recreational users of psychedelics would vacillate wildly between these extremes, often in the course of the same sentence. And as my personal favorite excerpt from this entire study, I would like to present this one. And I should mention this was a particularly heroic dose. So Madame Mushroom is a harsh mistress. If this had been my first experience, without a doubt, I would have called it a bad trip. But there are no bad trips, only difficult experiences. Well, this one was very difficult. Ego loss and afterwards, believing I'd lost my mind and thinking I'd eaten a poison mushroom and I was going to die, I wrote out the worst of it by thinking, you've been in a state like this before. It will pass. You're fine. Things can turn around so quickly. One moment I was thinking, this isn't strong enough. I need more. An hour later, I was rolling on the floor laughing and saying, I can't remember anything. I don't know what any of this means. And in another moment, again, time didn't exist and I couldn't tell what reality was. And I was terrified. And I knew it had to do with the mushrooms I'd eaten, but I didn't know what mushrooms were. There were no anchors. I knew my own name, for instance, but not what it meant to have a name. The state of mind I was in when I ate those shrooms was, I believe, what launched it into seriously effing dark territory. Ego loss can be beautiful or it can be terrifying. There's no real in between. Amnesia, events out of chronological order in my memory, thinking I was God, everything spinning faster and faster, out of control. I didn't find what I was looking for, but I did come back, an idea for a short story. So that's something. I wonder, was my experience normal for this dose? I don't think it was technically psychosis because I was aware that I was insane. So really, it was more a kind of delirium. I definitely felt crazy and it was terrifying. On the other hand, even after being through hell, I feel totally fine. And in fact, eager for my next planned experience. So gosh, that was so common to almost all of these reports. It included both the worst and the scariest of the lower unconscious, but also the best and the greatest of the higher unconscious. And that drove people to want to do it again, a lot of times. Now, theme 5 within my study was epiphanies and insights, and this included a lot of the goodies from Roberto Assagioli's higher unconscious. So this would include things like existential and deep thoughts, such as a sense of connectedness to all knowledge, the meaning of life, clarity with aspects of personal life, including things like guidance with self-improvement and life choices, insights into relationships, sudden remembrance and reframing of memories. Also, enhanced creative abilities, in particular, intuitive understanding of sound and music, as well as artistic inspiration of all different types, and permanent changes of perspective. So even after this temporary altered state faded away, there were things that were perceived in this state that could not be unseen or forgotten ever again. So, as a synthesis of everything that we've covered so far, we have the brain, it appears anyway, that the brain's shift closer to the critical point is regulated by astrocytes' maintenance of excitation-inhibition balance, appears to enable content from multiple levels of the unconscious to enter our subjective conscious awareness. And so the key to development of human potential comes down to a functional synthesis or integration of content from all of these different layers of the unconscious. You've got to sift through the difficult experiences from the lower unconscious to be able to access the greatest gifts, the higher unconscious. So this process is most effectively guided through humanistic and transpersonal approaches, such as Guilberto Assagioli's psychosynthesis. This is precisely what these branches of psychology are designed to do. So, on that note, closing thoughts. In summary, astrocytes, they help to resolve three long-standing issues in consciousness studies. One, the hard problem, in that they regulate all of the conditions necessary for quantum coherence to form in microcolumns of the brain, as stipulated by Joachim Kepler's zero-point field theory. Two, the binding problem, in that they are interconnected across the entire brain and spinal cord via gap junctions as a functional syncytium, enabling them to work together as a single unit. And three, anomalous experiences, in that they maintain excitation-inhibition balance and thus the phase of overall brain activity with respect to the critical point, seemingly enabling more complex, previously unconscious info and phenomena to enter our subjective conscious awareness. So at this point in the presentation, the question may arise, well, in our search for answers about consciousness, why hasn't this compilation of published facts about astrocytes come to light sooner? And I would suggest that it may have something to do with the streetlight effect as an allegory. So I'm sure all of you have heard variations of this story, often told as a joke, where you've got a guy looking for his keys, not by his car where he dropped them, but under a lamppost where it's better lit. And so similarly, David H. Freeman suggests that researchers tend to look for answers where the looking is good, rather than where the answers are likely to be hiding. And there's good reason for this. We tend to orient a lot of our searches in science based on where the spotlight is, and where the status is, and where the funding is. Yet, it may not be where the answers lie. In order to find the answers we seek, we may need to turn light on some places that have previously been pretty dark, including non-local theories of consciousness. Meanwhile, the search continues. Just last year, in June of 2023, at a famous 25-year bet originally initiated back in 1998, when Clinton was still president, this was settled between Christoph Koch and David Chalmers, Chalmers taking home the bottles of wine, based upon as yet inconclusive results with regard to the hard problem. Just a few interesting follow-up comments that I'd like to highlight. So David Chalmers suggested that the hard problem might be solved by assuming that information is a fundamental property of reality, not limited to brains alone. Similarly, zero-point field theory suggests that consciousness is a more fundamental, non-local aspect of the cosmos. Christoph Koch dismissed this hypothesis as untestable and hence pointless. However, the findings presented here for astrocytes may provide a powerful basis for empirical testing, and I have some preliminary ideas about how we might approach that. Finally, I just wanted to leave you with an excerpt from Quantum Magazine's video on brain criticality. You can find it on YouTube. Highly recommend it. As research continues to reveal tantalizing signatures of criticality, what was once a fringe theory has begun to attract more mainstream attention in the field, with researchers now hunting for what kinds of mechanisms might be responsible for tuning brains to the critical point. The big question that is unanswered so far is, what is the homeostatic mechanism bringing the brain to this quasi-critical region? That's the big open question. That's the million-dollar question. Well, my friends, I believe that the million-dollar answer may indeed be astrocytes. The questions, comments? I know that was a ton of information packed into a really tight time period, but super exciting stuff. So in the spirit of the brain radio concept, stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Very concise, but also informative and, just delightful.
Thank you,
Your thoughts on, what it is about maybe psychedelics. I mean, that seems to be one of the things that everybody's talking about now as, something once that was seen as a drug that was going to kill you and make you insane. And now
right.
something that seems to be, almost people are looking at it almost too good, like it's going to be this, cure
Panacea for all of their problems. Yeah.
all the things. And what's your understanding of how that may interface with these cells that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I feel like this is where certainly some of the most exciting research in consciousness is being done, because it is a place where you have this shift closer to the critical point where we can take these substances that do that for us. And so for a limited amount of time. And so, yeah, I feel that it's a really exciting space, and there is great work that can be done here. It is about then, and the psychedelic section of this talk, this was again 100 trip reports submitted by recreational users of these substances, whereas the recommendation is you work with a certified professional in these fields, and they help you have the best possible experience and get the most out of it. And it's gotten to the point where they know the type of music that can be played to help that person have maximize or optimize their experience. They are there to consult with that person with whatever experiences came up during that time. And so, yeah, I think that's probably a really good way to approach these, especially for someone who's new to them. Going with that approach where you're working with someone who at least has been around the block, as they say. So, yeah.
Do we know if psychedelics do something particular to the astrocytes?
Yes, so they do push it closer to the critical point. What is, oh, okay. So psychedelics they are serotonergic. So they work with the serotonin 2A receptor, which is for acute stress. And so I feel like that alerts the body that, okay, ordinarily we keep this box closed. We keep the critical point backed away from this, but we are under such stress right now. There may be something in that box that we otherwise keep closed that may help us out of this situation. And it, may push the brain activity closer to that critical point. And there are studies looking at the role of glutamate in psychedelic experiences as well. So and glutamate would be the excitatory transmitter that astrocytes regulate, just to reiterate that. Yeah.
So there's a lot of exciting stuff that's going on there. And where do you see yourself going with your studies in the future?
Yeah, so the first thing is finish my paper on this topic. So fortunately, as one of my final papers for class this semester, I put one together for one of my classes. And I think there's a couple additional things that I want to add to it. I want to run it by a number of different experts. But then the next stage would be working on, well, how do we test this hypothesis? So I talked to Anqiu Li, who's at the University of Michigan. I ran my science of consciousness presentation by him. He was into it. And so he's doing some really cool work with his colleagues, looking at, how to measure, how close the brain is to a critical point. So I think probably the three components that need to be included in my experiment are some sort of test on how astrocytes regulate this excitation inhibition balance, that portion. Then you've got another portion looking at the proximity to the critical point. And then you have a third element, which would be about the neurophenomenological aspect of it. So talking to people about what their conscious experience is. So playing with these three elements together in a single experiment. So, and I've been looking through a lot of papers that have been using like calcium imaging to look at the astrocyte portion of it. I feel like Philip Hayden at Tufts University, along with Michael Levin, that's where he is as well. He's been doing some great work too. And Peter Young, who I believe is at a university in Ohio, might be Ohio. No, it's not Ohio State. It's one of them in Ohio. He's done some really cool work with looking at scale-free elements of these astrocytic calcium waves, which is very cool. Now we have this, so one aspect of criticality is that it's scale free. So it's the activity there is not particular to any given spatiotemporal scale. So this may be how information travels up and down in, spatiotemporal scale across the great chain of being, if you will. And so with this study that I found from Peter Young, now we have that same scale-free element in these astrocytic calcium waves. So we have an electromagnetic sort of aspect showing this scale-free behavior as well as a neurochemical side. So that's really cool. So I feel like Stuart Hameroff, he connected with this because with this scale-free element to it, it appears that microtubules might be doing a similar thing at a different scale. And so these scale-free elements of it may be very closely related. So that's another aspect that I really want to look into.
So when you're talking about your dissertation, then I assume,
Yes.
are you going to be doing this sort of wild brain stuff, or is it going to be on a different type of topic? It seems like if you start moving into that medical, observations, that's a pretty intense dissertation.
For sure. But at the same time, honestly, this has been my driving force since 2011 when these experiences started happening to me. And I finally wrapped my head around, okay, other people have had experiences like this. And here's, from a conceptual perspective, what they're all about. But then once I had gathered enough information there, it was like, okay, how does this actually occur? What is going on? What are the mechanisms? So I feel like that's honestly where my heart lies, kind of connecting these spiritual experiences to the hardcore science and helping to bridge the gaps there. So I feel like it's going to come down to partnership with people in these different fields. So my committee, and I talked with
You're swinging big for sure.
for sure, for sure. So I need somebody on the team who, is in physics, and maybe Joachim Kepler, maybe Peter Young, and maybe one of these other folks. I need somebody in the neuroscience field, and maybe on and maybe, and then but the work has got to be done.
So. You're definitely, appear to have the work ethic for it. I mean, just look at
Yes.
the slides and the stuff that you're reading. You're tackling several large fields at once. So we wish
Yes.
all the great, success, because, you're helping us understand things that are, pretty sophisticated thing. I mean, I'm learning all kinds of stuff, and I'm sure anyone watching this will is as well, because these are difficult topics that you're making digestible to educated people. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for saying that. And I feel so. My dad was an is retired now, but was an electrical engineer, and he worked for one company his entire life, Pico Energy, the Philadelphia electric company, which I think is Exelon now, or bought by somebody else. But anyway, so his approach, unlike his colleagues, was they would say, okay, we got this problem here, let's fix it this way. My dad had a colored penciled map of the entire territory. And so he would say, no, you can't do that, because then you're going to have problems here, 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 and here. So I feel like that's in my DNA. And so I've always had this desire, if I get into a project, I got to understand the big picture. I can't just do this little element. So that's been the driving force again for me this entire time. So 17 years later, I feel like this stuff is super exciting, and it's gotten to the point. Oh, and that was the other thing. So at the Science of Consciousness conference, this was helping to explain some things that have been inexplicable. For example, one of the plenary speeches, the things that I am presenting about what astrocytes do, they were attributed to emergent behavior. And this is why Stuart Hameroff ended up going to my talk, because I kind of pushed back on those ideas. And in another segment in the electrophysiology section, the top bullet point for the conclusion was, okay, so I have found that anesthesia, when applied, we see fragmented activity among the neurons and large clusters of neuronal activity. And I said, okay, well, is it possible that since astrocytes and their calcium signaling are sensitive to anesthesia, that they are driving this fragmentation of neuronal activity? And in that state, then you have this nearest neighbor interactions taking over. This is based on some videos I was watching from John Beggs, who originally, along with Dietmar Plens, took this physics concept of criticality and started applying it to neuroscience, to the brain. And the guy was like, yeah, that's a good idea. So, I mean, this is exciting stuff, I feel like, pulling it all together. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for doing
thrilled.
so. We're going to end the recording here, and then maybe you and I can just chat for a second. But thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to
Yeah. Thank